now. So, welcome to our day on presiding at the Eucharist with a group of curates who, in the normal stretch of things, would be priests and presiding at the Eucharist by now. That will happen in September, but it's a good chance for us to reflect and learn from each other. And I'm really pleased that David Britton, who is an area dean and also a training incumbent, is going to join us now and tell us something about presiding at the Eucharist for him. David, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Andy. Hi, everyone. I can only see a few of you in my screen, so hello to everyone. Hope you're doing well. Hope you had a good day. Hope you're surviving these strange times. And yes, very sorry to not be with you in person. It would have been lovely to have done this in person, as Alex mentioned on his video in All Saints West Ham. So doing things slightly differently, but I thought I would take the opportunity to do this in church so you can see the setup. Can you actually see it okay? Because
Yeah.
I've got a little screen. Is that okay? You can see the setup. So this is how we have it set up. So I'm Vicar of St. John's, Leytonstone. So I'm going to just, I was given the brief, how do I preside at communion? I wasn't sure which angle to take, whether we're looking at things quite practically or more theologically. So basically, I just thought, I'm just going to do it kind of personally as to how I preside. And of course, that is very much shaped by my tradition. And I think there's a whole, I'm assuming we've got the whole breadth of tradition here within the church. I think it's helpful to hear from Alex and then also Kate and myself. So my tradition is really, I was formed in the charismatic evangelical tradition. I grew up as an Anglican. My dad was a vicar and he was from the kind of charismatic evangelical tradition as well. So that very much shaped his churchmanship and the way the church I grew up in formed or became. And then at university I found myself being part of Vineyard Church and then a New Frontiers Church. And I don't know if you know those particular churches, but they're not known for holding communion or the Eucharist as central to their part of worship. My one recollection was in a Vineyard Church. And basically it was a time of sung worship. That's what these churches are big on. And during that time of sung worship, you could get up out of your seat whenever you wanted, and there was a table on the side with some wine and some bread. I think it was probably non-alcoholic wine, and you just simply went and helped yourself. And I just remember at the time growing up as an Anglican thinking, well, this is a bit different. Not quite sure what I think about this. But that memory has stuck with me. Fast forward a few years, I'm now back within the fold of Anglicanism. Just about, because my sending church was also quite charismatic evangelical, and it would have the occasional nod to the Church of England. It did have a traditional communion service every Sunday early in the morning, but otherwise communion for their main services was, I think they always opted for prayer H, because that was the shortest prayer, so we can get it over and done with and move on to more singing. I'm being slightly tongue-in-cheek, but that's a kind of tradition I was formed in. But then I went for training at Ridley Hall, and this was during the time of Chris Coxworth, when he was there, certainly for my first year. And I don't know if people know Bishop Coxworth, but he is also from a similar tradition to what I came from, but he is very Eucharistic-centered in his theology, and he was someone who really opened my eyes. And his kind of phrase during our time there was, we can be word people, we can be spirit people, but we're also table people. And he really opened my eyes to seeing the value and the centrality of the Eucharist and also liturgy in worship. And that was quite a formative time for me. And at the same time, I was then placed in the church, which was, again, it was identified as a kind of Eucharistic-centered church, fairly middle of the road, Church of England, but communion every Sunday. I did a placement at Southwark Cathedral, for 6 weeks, which is again a great experience. So all these things kind of formed and influenced my understanding of the importance of communion and how I come to view it in our worship, in our spirituality, in our relationship with God. Back to my curacy, that was in Southwark Diocese, and again it was back into a fairly low evangelical church where communion was, I suppose if you're looking at the common worship, you'd say every service was a service of the word, and communion was a kind of a response, tucked away at the back of the service. That did change a little bit. I had an interregnum, so I kind of did some changes and brought some of the formational elements from being my placement church and my training into that parish. Then I arrived at St. John's in Leytonstone, and St. John's is really, it kind of categorized itself as just traditional Anglican. And it certainly is very traditional. They love the prayer book, but it was part of that traditional Church of England churches where I think there was a big Eucharistic movement, and there was a group which slightly resisted and would insist on doing a Book of Common Prayer matins instead of communion every Sunday. So that still existed in this church when I arrived. So every third Sunday of the month it would be sung matins at 10:30, and it would be an all-age service, another service. So our pattern is 2 services of communion at our main service, twice a month, service of the word, family all-age service. But they also have midweek Book of Common Prayer, and I'd never done that before until I arrived here, so that was a good learning experience. So how was all that shaped me? I suppose one of the things that I've learnt as I've been part of different churches and I've sought to learn from people is that I guess if I'm presiding at communion, I will, if I'm arriving in a place, I will try to honour their tradition and honour it fully. And I think that's important. And I also think it's important to learn from the different approaches different church traditions have when it comes to how we preside and what we can learn from each other. And my experience really throughout friendships with other people, throughout being placed in very different types of churches, is really, how to say, it's an enriching of my tradition. And I've come, as someone who is still, very much a charismatic, actually, it's quite logical to see how important the celebration of communion is, that's the language we use in this church, is to engaging with God, to encountering with God. It is quite a deeply charismatic event. We are praying for the Spirit to come. We are feeding on Christ through our hearts. So for me, that has been one of the really important ways of engaging with communion and trying to shape what place it has within our worshiping life of the church. So how does this come in terms of just coming down to practical things? So I'm just going to, I've got a phone call on my phone, so I'll switch that off. How does this shape how I provide? Well, first of all, the one thing I'll say is an encounter with God. I think coming to the table, celebrating the Eucharist, celebrating Holy Communion, whatever language you use, is really, it's a way of encountering God. And personally for me, it takes a special place. I think there is special grace in this act when we come together around the table, this thing that Jesus instituted that clearly had a central place within the life of the early church that was so serious. Paul would say, no one can come to the table in an unworthy manner. It's a place of encountering God, and it's a place of unique, special grace. And so in a practical way, what would that say? Well, at the start of our communion prayers, I always opt for, the Lord is here, His Spirit is with us. That's what I always tend to emphasize. I want to remind people that when we're around the table, God is present with us. As Jesus said, where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, he is there with us. So I want to emphasize that. Then as we look through the prayer, the next line we say is lift up your hearts. And it's a lifting up, it's a directing our attention to God and directing our hearts and our minds to him. And then the third line, let us give thanks to the Lord our God. It is right to give thanks and praise. And as Alex mentioned in his video, why the word Eucharist is such a great word, it is all about giving thanks. Then we have the reminder of the gospel and how this shapes how I preside. Well, do you know what? Out of all the prayers we have, there's certain prayers that you hone in on. The ones that I tend to use are prayer E and H and a little bit of D. When I arrived at this church, they only ever used prayer A. So part of what I did was introduce them to new Eucharistic prayers. One of the things I love about prayer E is that in the normal preface that you use, it basically in 3 lines summarizes the entire gospel. Father, you made the world, love your creation. You gave your son, Jesus Christ, to be our savior. His dying and rising have set us free from sin and death. It's a wonderful reminder in such a succinct way of the gospel. And one of the things I learned at Southern Cathedral, which was a congregation that grew massively in the space of quite a short period of time, without any overt evangelistic programs that you might expect, that kind of more evangelical churches might do. But for them, one of the things I learned is that they saw the Eucharist as fundamentally an evangelistic event. I remember one of the canon pastors there saying, when we come to the table, we are evangelizing. And actually, when we say these words, we're speaking the gospel in a wonderfully succinct way. I also love, just a personal thing, I love prayer E because at the end, after the acclamation, it says, Lord of all life, help us to work together for that day when your kingdom comes and justice and mercy will be seen in all the earth. It's a reminder that the gospel is about what Christ has done, but we're also participating in the gospel to see God's kingdom on earth, and particularly working towards that day of justice. So it is about an encounter with God. It is a reminder and it is a proclamation of the gospel. Thirdly, my approach to presiding is very much seeing this, that it is a collective act of worship, and it is a point of unity in the church, a way of coming together. And I know that there's been some debates about whether we should be presiding, online and people watching. And one of the arguments against it is that fundamental to communion is the gathering, that we are gathering. And if you see in the orders of service, in order 1, it begins with the gathering of the people. Something to think about. I know a question came up about presiding in lockdown and all those kinds of fairly deep theological questions that a lot of people are wrestling with. But for me, communion is a gathering. So here at St. John's, we've taken the decision not to do a communion service in church. While people have been in their homes, I have personally done all our worship services from my own home. That might change just as we're transitioning to reopening, but certainly for the period where everyone was very much restricted, we took the decision to simply do worship in our own homes and not in the church because of this emphasis on the gathering together. I want to emphasize that as we gather together, that it's very much a we. You can't quite see it from where we are. I could turn the camera around possibly, but basically I'm standing in an altar which is pretty much miles away from the congregation. So in front of me, I've got choir stalls, and then I've got pews about half a mile away. It's a pretty big church here. One of the things I would love to do is have a nave altar, because for me, celebrating communion amongst the people is what it is all about. Interestingly, this congregation are not there yet. They quite like coming up to the chancel, so it's a battle. It's an ongoing battle. But for me, having communion in the nave emphasizes that fact that we are gathered together and we are gathered around the table, and that it is a collective we. It's not the priest miles away doing his kind of act of worship, but actually it's a corporate thing. It's a collective thing. Another formational thing of that from my tradition, personally in my curacy churches, we didn't wear robes when we presided at the table. No canon law allows you not to if the church is happy with that. I do here because that's what the church allows, but I don't. For me, it's not a deal breaker. Other aspects of my tradition which shaped my approach, in terms of posture. Now, Alex spoke about his choice of posture, which I really enjoyed listening to. And posture is quite important. And thinking about why you do what you do is also quite important. And for me, my posture with communion is quite simple. I will have my hands open for most of the time. And I'll do that because I want to emphasize the fact that it is a kind of a we that are gathered here together. And I guess I want to emphasize the kind of the openness, the inclusiveness, and we have our hands open at the end for the blessing to emphasize that, you know, we're here to receive from God. You know, you have your hands open when you want to receive something. So for me, having my hands open is my default posture when I'm reading the communion prayers. I also want to emphasize that when we're praying for the Spirit to come, we're actually praying for the Spirit to come upon us, not just particularly directed to the elements. Another aspect of my theological background is that I want to emphasize the sacrament of the Eucharist is the sacrament of the action of coming together around the table, of taking the bread and the wine, of receiving from God. Not so much in focusing on the sacralized objects of the elements of the bread and the wine. If you want to do some kind of more reading about this, there's a couple of interesting articles by Rowan Williams. They might be online, but they're in his book on Christian theology, where he talks about, you know, moving away from seeing sacrament very much in the sacralized objects, more to sacrament action. And yeah, you can go away and read more of that. But that again has also shaped my approach to how I preside. So I personally don't tend to raise the host, although I'll caveat that, because if I'm in a church where that is a tradition, I will do it. It's not a kind of deal breaker for me, but personally, I won't when I'm here. We don't have, we don't draw attention to the bread and wine in other ways. I will also make sure that I receive the bread and the wine after everyone else. That was something I picked up in my curacy church, which I found quite helpful, is reminding me of the servant nature of this, that you're here to serve people. Back to the coming together, I also want communion to be, as I mentioned, it's an inclusive act, but I want to try and make it as inclusive as possible. And I do this through a couple of ways, is that I mentioned I love prayer E. I also love prayer H. Maybe that is just formation in my church where they always chose prayer H because it's really short. But actually, I love prayer H because it is very inclusive. It's very participatory. Interestingly, when I arrived, it was the prayer they used for their old age communion service. But I thought, you know, why every Sunday should be an old age service. So we do that. We also here, I don't know if you could see, when children come, young children come, we'll give them some raisins as well, just to emphasize that it's something special for them as well, that when we can pray their blessing, they can have some raisins and they can participate as well. Again, that was something that I stole from my Ascending church, which is quite a nice idea. So really, that's summarised, and that pretty much shapes how I do, how I would preside. A couple of things that I found helpful that picked up in my formation and training is the way we read liturgy. And I've been pointed out when I've read liturgy in a kind of very, I don't know what the word is, very vicarly type voice, and challenged to think about how liturgy, if we try and speak it in a way that we might speak other words, so therefore it doesn't take a kind of unique significance. Actually, it enables us to really kind of see the value of it in that way. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but I suppose what that ends up being is that I think it's really important to try and memorize bits of liturgy so that you can look at the congregation in the eye and engage them in that level, in that way. So so the first bit I memorized was the invitation, draw near with faith, receive. So I would say, draw near with faith, receive the body of our Lord Jesus Christ, which is broken for you, and his blood, which he shed for you. Eat and drink in remembrance that he died for you, and feed on him in your hearts by faith. The invitation is much more powerful if you are able to speak it, looking at people in the eye. And so I would take this opportunity to try and memorize bits of the Eucharistic prayers, so that when you are saying them, when they are to be spoken to people, you can actually speak them to people rather than being glued to the text and worrying about that. The second practical thing of that is, if you know it well enough, actually when it comes to it, there's lots of things to think about in terms of movement and in terms of what you do with your hands. And if you don't need to worry about the words so much because you know them quite well, that again is very helpful. And another helpful thing is if just the page turns by mistake, you're not suddenly lost and flustered. So that's a practical thing that I've picked up, which I think is very helpful, and I'd commend you to go and to memorize bits of liturgy. And then Bishop Stephen, in his curacy, I think he had to spend his first year memorizing all the prayers, but it really does have its value. And it's so much more powerful to speak it to someone. And dare I say, I'd say it's better to speak the words to someone looking at them in the eye and maybe get them occasionally wrong than focusing on the particular words and being glued to the text. But again, that for me emphasizes the point that we are here together to gather around the table. I think that's about it in terms of what I've got. I know there's a Q&A later. Did anyone have any questions now?
David, thank you so much. Let's take the next sort of 15 minutes or so, and anyone that has a question for David, now is your moment. Just unmute yourself and speak.
David, thanks for that. It was really helpful. I love what you said about the inclusive nature of communion. I love the idea with the raisins. How do you balance that with the kind of exclusive, you can only take communion if you're baptized kind of thing? So how does that come out in the way that you lead?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think that has always been one of the ongoing tensions, because like I mentioned earlier, quoting from Paul, anyone who comes in a manner unworthy shouldn't come to the table. But so the advantage in the Church of England is that we don't ask questions when people come. So for me, I come to that tension by thinking, at the end of the day, it isn't actually my responsibility. The responsibility is between them and God. And actually, that's who they're going to be accountable. They're not going to be accountable to me to police it. So I'll be honest with you, there's been times when I've been giving communion and I've looked at someone and they don't, on the outside, don't seem in any fit state to receive it. And I've kind of wavered and I thought, you know what, it's not my place. It's not my place. So in that sense, I'll emphasize the inclusiveness that when they come and they can come to receive. And I personally won't ask questions at the time. If they're people who I, you know, when you've got a relationship with someone, so when someone asked me, they're fairly new Christian, when should I receive communion? I said, well, don't receive it until you've been baptized. But then once you've been baptized, if you feel you want to receive it, you can do, but also we will explore confirmation at the same time. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, thank you, David. Just one question that I have. You say about raising the host.
Yeah.
Or not raising the host.
Yeah.
What makes you decide whether you do or don't? Because for me, raising the host allows people to focus on it for a moment. It's almost like a pause.
Yeah, that's a good. I mean, the reason I said my theological reason would be to detract from the emphasis on the particular elements, and I want to emphasize the sacrament of the whole action. So that would be my kind of theological response. I still will pause though, so to give a bit of a break, because and so that people know that this is, you know, this is a sacred moment. Yeah, I mentioned it, but again, like I said, it's not I don't feel too strongly. It's what I do here, and it's what I would do in my own church that I would be leader of. But actually, I've been to other churches where that is their tradition, and I will honour that tradition. I won't impose my own theological view on that. I take your point about the pause. Yeah, I think that's important.
David, it may be allied to that question, but we were talking earlier about the sense of what's technically called in persona Christi, whether the priest feels themselves to be standing in the person of Christ as they preside. Do you feel you're in some sense taking the role of Jesus in this or not?
That's a very good question. No, I haven't articulated it in my own thought in that sense. And again, I suppose this is just, I'm speaking very personally here, so I'm not, you know, I'll say why I do something and I don't want to make a judgment on, or even stake a claim as to whether it's right or wrong, because let's be honest with you, there are far brighter people who can give some good theological rationales. For me, growing up in a pretty low church tradition has where the priesthood of all believers is very much a part of that tradition. So I've been to services, well, like in other denominations, where it's not the priest or the church leader who would be presiding. That wouldn't be the word we'd use at the time, but you know, it would be sharing in the Lord's Supper. But that's the extent to what communion would be in that setting. So that would be my shaping. I mean, it's a good question for me to ponder on, really. I haven't thought of that myself. But what I am doing is just on a continued journey. So I've been ordained for 10 years, and I would say, I can't say I've arrived at a fixed point, and this is what I will be like in another 10 years' time. And I think that's important, that we are on a lifelong journey of learning. So 5 years' time, I might contradict everything I've just said.
No problem. A question about practicalities. Do you wash your hands at certain points? If so, is that a hygiene issue or is that symbolic for you?
We don't have that in our church tradition. Now we just have the tradition of where is it? We just have this tradition. No, we don't have that. We would lay the table. I don't receive the gifts, but we do lay them on the on the table as I'm coming to it, rather than it already set up before the service. But no, we wouldn't. Washing of hands isn't part of that. It isn't part of this church tradition. That's, yeah.
Any other questions for David?
I'll go again, Andy. Watching other priests, you see a lot of hand movement, crossing, as you said about opening your hands wide, all inclusive.
Yeah.
Are there any specific hand gestures that you do make or you don't make, and why?
What do I make? Let me just go back to the prayers just to see how I do things. Well, I think the one that I mentioned about that is the most intentional hand gesture. I will, when I say send your Holy Spirit, well, send your Holy Spirit to come down. Do I have any other hand gestures? I think I don't. I think I just, obviously we have our hands together when we're, I will lift the bread to make point, on the night before he died, he had supper with his friends. Taking bread, so I'll take the bread at that moment, he praised you. Broke the bread, gave it to them, and said, take, eat, this is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Then when supper was ended, he took the cup of wine. Again, he praised you, gave it to them and said, drink this, all of you. This is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. So we'll pause for a moment. And then I am intentionally back to the hands out. So that is my most intentional hand movement. Book of Common Prayer on the midweek Wednesday emphasizes touching the chalice and the bread. So I'll do that in keeping with the Book of Common Prayer. Yeah.
Thank you. Time for one more question.
I've got a question. So I've seen when priests preside, they'll break the bread, whether it's bread or a wafer, and then they hold it back together again.
Yes. Yeah.
What's that about?
Thank you. That is one thing I do. Sorry, thank you for reminding me. Yeah. So I will say, so I've got a wafer, so I will, I'll do that. I'll say, we break this bread to share in the body of Christ. And it says, though we are many, we are one body. So it's the emphasis is when we say one body is when I'll bring it back together. So though we are many, we are one body. And I've just suddenly forgotten the rest of the words. So it's the emphasis of the oneness that we are, and the one meeting in the one body. Which just on that point, because I want to emphasize that we are coming together, that we are one body, I'm not fixed in my head how happy I am about doing communion without the common cup, without the chalice. I did the Sunday before lockdown, where we were advised to do communion but not to share in the common cup, and the priest would take the wine. I did do that, but I did it and then felt a bit uncomfortable, and I wasn't sure about it. So that's a kind of a continuing wrestling, because I would want to, and again, it came to the reason why I decided not to do leading my online worship from the church, because I was thinking, well, if no one else can get in the church, then why should I get in the church? This is my personal opinion. Interestingly, some people really value seeing the church building, so I'm not necessarily suggesting that I'm actually correct in this. I was surprised at how my own congregation loved seeing the building in images of our online worship, and actually that was a source of comfort for them. But for me personally, I didn't want to do something that everyone else couldn't participate in, which is why I feel a bit uncomfortable about taking communion and just me consuming the wine as the priest. And I think, in fact, I had a midweek service after that where we all just took the bread. But that's just a continue, you know, I'm just saying this is where I'm at in my thinking. I don't have a fixed thought of it, but that's what I'm kind of wrestling with. And the reason why I'm wrestling with it is because of this, you know, this kind of oneness question.
David, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to stop recording. We are really grateful. And we will all be back. David, if you're free, you're very welcome with us as well. At 1 o'clock, when we'll be sharing a love feast. I'll explain what a love feast is at 1, but if you could have some food and drink to hand, that would be fantastic. And if there are other members of your household that would like to join with us, well, it's up to them entirely, but they'll be welcome to.